My lords, may I add my voice to the swelling chorus, the paeans of praise to Baroness Lloyd. It's no small thing to make your maiden speech at that dispatch box. And I did enjoy the way she conjured the image of the subterranean river Effra, encased under all those tons of tarmac and concrete flowing slowly beneath our feet, arched over by those visionary engineers in the Victorian era who incorporated it into the drainage and sewage system of London. Something else that is flowing subterranean through this debate is the assumption that government help is intrinsically virtuous and beneficial. The assumption that if there's a problem, it's for politicians to fix it. People in this line of work have, I suppose, a very natural predilection to want to look useful. And this can lead us into the fallacy of saying, here is a problem. It needs something done. Oh, there's a something. Let's do that. But when has nationalisation ever been a long-term solution to an industrial problem? Not least in the case of steel. The nationalisation didn't work in 1949. The nationalisation didn't work in 1967. Not because the people who were put in charge of British Steel were the wrong people, not because they were bad people, not because they were selfish or lazy. I mean, some of them presumably were by the law of averages, but no more than anyone else. Simply because a government bureaucrat doesn't have the same incentives as somebody who actually owns an enterprise. And we have seen that dynamic play out again and again. It's extraordinary in a way that this needs saying. But when we had that emergency debate on the legislation back in April, I think mine was the only voice, along with that of Lord Kerr of Kinlochard, to make the case in principle against government intervention. I think there were 2 or 3 in the other place, and that was it. 30 years ago, it would have been assumed that things were better left to the private sector. And that change in our assumptions, that vibe shift, goes a long way to explaining why our growth has slowed as a country. The one thing that the government can do is to get out of the way. And what I mean here by get out of the way is to stop legislating to give this country the most expensive industrial energy in the developed world. The reason that we have uncompetitive steel-intensive industry, energy-intensive industries, not just steel, but AI and everything in between, is because of a series of needless choices that we have made, which have had the effect of pushing up the cost of electricity. And now, you may say that that's the price worth paying. You may say that it's either that or lose the viability of the planet. But then admit that that's the trade-off. Please don't look surprised when energy-using industries then have to shed productivity and employment. Energy isn't just one among many commodities. It is the vector of economic growth. Yes. The story of the rise of human civilization is the story of the fall in energy prices as we moved from fire to kerosene to modern electricity, nuclear, and all the rest of it. We've become the only civilization that's ever tried to rip out a modern energy infrastructure and go back to something more expensive. And of course, there are consequences when you do that. I think there were 2 arguments that I've heard for government intervention. Forgive me if I'm missing anything. One was to do with jobs, and one was to do with security. I think we're too late on the jobs one. As my noble friend Lord Pryor said, we're dealing now with the residue of an industry, no longer with the great global leader that it would have been. I hope noble lords won't think me ungallant if I point out that Baroness Lloyd and Lord Stockwood and I are all about the same age. And so we didn't grow up with the rhythm of the clangs and groans and hisses of steelworks. It was already gone in the 70s. The big decline in both productivity and employment happened in the 70s, not as a result of trade, but as a result of technological advance that meant that more produce could be turned out by fewer workers. In fact, in the 80s, there was an increase in steel production in this country, but a continuing decrease in employment because of efficiencies and those technological gains. And this is something that the whole world has seen. So please don't let's hold out the false idea that we can somehow go back, if we wanted to the kinds of levels of employment that my old friend, the noble Lord Mohammed, was conjuring in his speech about growing up in Sheffield. That world isn't going to be brought back. And the challenge for a responsible government is, what do we find as alternatives? How do we carry on moving up the production chain? How do we carry on specialising in what we do best as a country? Yes, of course, if you want to, you can prop up jobs at great cost to everyone else. But it's worth looking at the figures here. According to the House of Commons Library, there are 37,000 people employed in our steel industry. It's about 0.1% of our workforce. Let's put that number in context by looking at the numbers employed in steel-using industries, in the sectors that will be most impacted by tariffs or government interventions that serve to push up the price of their steel inputs. 95,000 people work in aerospace. 166,000 work in car production. 476,000 work in agriculture. I think the better part of 2 million work in house building. These are all industries that use steel and whose interest is in having as low a price as possible. As for security, again, you'd think sometimes, listening to the debate, both in this chamber and outside, that we and China are the only two steel-producing countries in the world, and that we need to protect ourselves against a massive influx of goods from a country that is a security threat and is dumping. Noble Lords may be surprised to learn that China is not in our top 10 sources, not in our top 10 overseas suppliers. Our biggest suppliers are Spain, Germany, and Belgium. And our fastest growing suppliers, proportionately, are India, Vietnam, and Turkey. Actually, no bad thing that we are diversifying away from the European Union, given how unreliable a trading partner it has just shown itself to be, with this threatened 50% tariff on our steel. Now, I'm not sure that they will actually go through with a 50% tariff on our steel. My guess is that it is part of their negotiating position in advance of the renegotiation of the TCA, that they will be delighted by the response of the noble Lord Little, which is precisely what the threat was designed to elicit, and indeed the ecstatic ululations from, he's no longer in his place, from my colleague Lord Deben. At the very least, I think this is part of trying to get a better deal on fisheries and whatever, but of course what they'd really like is for us to throw away our independent trading policy and, as Lord Little suggests, join their customs union and then subject ourselves to all of the greater tariffs from other countries. But, my lords, we benefit both as an importer and as an exporter. We benefit from having bigger markets. Raw figures, we export 4.8 billion pounds worth of steel every year. We import 7.4 billion. By and large, we are exporting the more high-grade stuff and importing the cheaper stuff, but we import both ways round. We benefit both ways round. It's better for us to have cheaper inputs, and of course it's good for us to have the revenue, and none of that will be assisted if we try to close ourselves off and become more autarkic. You do not become a more secure country by trying to produce everything yourself. You become a more secure country by having the widest possible diversity of suppliers so that you are not vulnerable to a local shock or disruption which might as easily happen on your own territory as anywhere else. And the thing that is really making us insecure is the squeezing of the private sector, the squeezing of the revenue-generating bit of our economy to fund the revenue-consuming bit of our economy, not least by measures like this one, which leave taxpayers on the hook for loss-making industry. The change in the size of the British state since the Guildford Three were in Tony Blair's office is extraordinary. 34p in the pound was spent by the government in those days. Now it's 45p in the pound. That is why we are not succeeding economically in the way that we used to. And until we address that, until we begin to reverse that imbalance, we're not going to be able to release the creative genius of our people. I'll just leave you, my lords, with this thought. We are not the experts here. There may be all sorts of people with experience in the steel industry, but that doesn't give them the same proximity and expertise that actual ownership and involvement in the industry does. If a bunch of people from Scunthorpe or Port Talbot or any of the other steelworks came here and said, here's how you should change the composition of the House of Lords, here's the time of day that you should have your committee meetings, and here are a few changes that we would suggest you make in the protocols of how you do debates, we would no doubt thank them politely for their input, but we would maintain quite correctly that we are the experts here. Please, let's have the modesty to accept that the same is true the other way around.